Hey, good morning or good afternoon or whatever time it is. I have a hard time even knowing what day of the week it is anymore. I don't know if I'm alone. I wanted to go through chapter 5. I believe you've already gotten the presentation for chapter 4, correct? Trying to get my head straight. I did my online book release on Tuesday. It was also my birthday on Tuesday. And so I've been kind of focused. I was focused on that and getting that together. It was cool. It was a little question and answer afterwards. So now I'm like honing in on what I need to do for you, which includes going through chapter 5 lecture slides as well as chapter 6. And then, on Friday, I believe we have a Zoom conference set up so we can go over any of the, material and look at the study guide. And some people had some questions on the content. So hopefully some of you will join me then. I can also talk a little bit about the video blogs that are coming up. Although the information is provided, not everybody necessarily kind of gets it right. So we can talk about that. But it's my first Zoom with the students. I actually did a guided meditation via Zoom. I recently did an interview for kind of a talk show. Everybody's doing a talk show now, so did an interview, and I've always done all kinds of things on digital media, so it's no big difference for me. So let's get right into it. So as you already know, this is an introductory sociology class, so a lot of the information that you get, although there's some theories, it's a lot of conceptual stuff. It's like the words that are used within the field. So then when you're describing something specific and you use a word, for example, when you talk about groups, there's all kinds of groups that you could talk about. So you can't just loosely use the term group unless you specifically say if it's an aggregate or a category. A lot of categories, a lot of demographic categories. This reminds me too, I need to get my census form done. I'll probably do it on paper and mail it in old school. I don't know yet. Got to look and see how many questions there are. But those definitely have categories. When you talk about race, ethnicity, gender, demographic profiles, things like that. There's also primary and secondary groups. The primary group is the one, close friends, family members. It's tightest. If you kind of look at yourself in the middle of this, all these circles, and there's closer that people are in the circle, and the more intimate they are, probably the more face-to-face, emotion-based interactions you have with them. And then you're part of a larger circle, could be, fellow employees, and then people in your classes, and then becomes your neighborhood, community, state, country, world. It's like that. Why do we have groups? Groups do serve a purpose. And when we talk about dynamics is, I love the word dynamics because it talks about all those intricate processes that happen amongst people, the interactional dynamics, for example, within a group, how they interact with each other. What about the leadership of the group? Well, overall, though, why do we have groups? And there's two very basic reasons why. One is instrumental to create something, achieve something. It could be a product group. It could be a film. It could be anything that people get together. It's cooperative work. Obviously, groups, we can look at teams. Sports teams are groups. They're task-oriented, right? They have cooperative work. And then we have the expressive groups where they fulfill emotional needs. They allow for self-expression and support. Alcoholics Anonymous, Narcotics Anonymous, Gamblers Anonymous. But you can see there's power within the group to be able to help move people towards, the goal that they seek. And it could be like personal fulfillment. For some people, like a group, an expressive group would be better for them than going to a therapist. Does size matter? This joke really doesn't work as well on camera, but it works well in the classroom. And yes, size does matter. If someone tells you it doesn't, they're just being nice. But there is the smallest group that you could possibly have is a group of 2 people that's called a dyad. Now, if you just add one more person to a dyad, it becomes a triad. But the dynamics of the group differ significantly. When you have a dyad and you're trying to make a decision, you can go back and forth. Sometimes you never reach that. When you have a third person and there's a kind of that majority rules, two people have this position, one person has this, normally we have this pressure to conform to what the group, the largest number of group members would like. And if you think about juries and things like that, there's groups where that kind of pressure is exerted. The absolute size of the group, is like the actual number of members, and the relative size is the potential number of members. So both, just like groups have have purposes of instrumental and expressive, also does the leadership. So group leadership is important. I personally think that not everybody is an effective leader at all. I've actually worked for many people who were not effective leaders at all. So just because someone is in a leadership position, structurally does not mean functionally they can carry that out. Then there's also people who really don't take the time to evaluate their own leadership. You have to look at your leadership. You have to look at if there's any changes that you want to make, and you have to work cooperatively with the people that you lead. It's not a dictatorship, although some people do exhibit authoritarian leadership styles, which is like a dictator. So if you kind of put these three on a continuum, if I was in a classroom, I would write three things on the whiteboard. I would write, on one side I would write authoritarian, on the other side I would write laissez-faire, and then in the middle of this continuum I would put democratic. Where there's participatory management, like you get the input, but you could be the sole decision maker, but you don't make the decision on your own. The laissez-faire leader, it's almost like non-leadership. I know you're familiar with Ash's research and read it in the book. Definitely do that. That is a classic experiment on looking at group conformity and how people will go against what they actually believe, or will go against truth itself in the presence of others who believe in another direction. Now, whether they really believe what the other members are putting out there is really not important. It's about like avoiding ostracism and complying. So compliance is approval. And when we talk about things like stigmatization, most of us try to avoid it, and especially in situations where there's not a huge cost. If you say that this particular line is the longest. Milgram's research kind of extended this kind of idea of the way in which we can remove accountability for ourselves if we're in this position where we want to be obedient. So like this whole idea of obedience, if you think of where it eventually or initially starts, it starts with whoever our caregivers were. They're the ones that imposed their own demands on us. In order to find the most benefit result, you have to be obedient. But in this particular case, where these different roles were played out, the person who was considered the teacher, who was actually the person who was, the subject of the experiment, the subject of the experiment really thought they were harming someone else, but because the experimenter was there and they had some level of position and authority, they just continued with the experiment. So, the things that we might do for someone who is, supposedly our leader, right? This is the results of what happened over time, and you see people. There was a taper off. There was a certain level of compassion and empathy, but at the very end, there's still. Like if you look at the danger severe, it's almost like 70% still. So majority of people continue to press a button. Kind of extending beyond kind of these ideas is this idea of groupthink, is which members of a cohesive group arrive at a decision. So I see this play out all the time. And I love watching the end of world films, I can't think, Armageddon and stuff like that. There's always this, the leadership, the governmental leadership will bring together these content experts, and they're all sitting in a room, and everybody's kind of leaning in one way, but there's always that rogue scientist that feels like they go another way, and no one really listens to him or her. And then towards the end of the movie, they have no other option but to listen to him or her, and then that saves the entire planet. It happens. I see it all the time. There are bureaucracy. Definitely, read this chapter. I'm sure you will. But bureaucracy is interesting because in order to handle large volumes. So if you're like the government, for example, there is embedded within it kind of this rigidity, because it can't just be loosey-goosey. We kind of know that, right? But there are some disadvantages of bureaucracy. There, and again, the rigidity of it and the ability to make changes quickly. So that sometimes inhibits people's individual change depending upon how slow the bureaucracy works. So there are shortcomings. Having someone I was a contractor for a couple government agencies. One was called the Resolution Trust Corporation, and it was an outgrowth of the FDIC during the failed savings and loans crisis. And we had this big manual, and every time like something changed, everybody would get like this new page, and you had to find it in this thick manual. There was this whole bureaucratic process. Everything just so slow. When I worked for the Centers for Disease Control and the Employment Office, hiring process is so slow. This is kind of like a conceptual idea of what the hierarchy of authority might look like in a company. We have a CEO, then you might have a VP on this level. There's some assistants to those people, and then you've got seniors and juniors all the way down to administrative assistants. And it's this interesting. Organizational hierarchy is interesting because a lot of times it guides the dynamics and the interaction between groups. Definitely look up the bureaucratic personality and C. Wright Mills' Cheerful Robots. Those are really, classic ideas of what all this group conformity means, especially as it relates to, how we approach life. Are we really smiling because we really like our job, or are we a lot of it has to do like the company man. You never heard of that before. People whose identity becomes what they do for a living. That's the end of this chapter. So I hope it was helpful for you. Let me know in the announcements, like reply underneath that you've seen this, because I want to get a sense of who's actually making efforts to watch these videos. I'm gonna put this one out, and then I'm gonna get going on chapter 6. Have a great day.